Every movement tells a story about who belongs and who doesn't. In this episode, I sit down with filmmaker Michael Premo, whose new documentary, Homegrown, follows three everyday Americans drawn into the Proud Boys long before January 6th. This isn't about excusing extremism. It's about understanding how community, grievance, and belonging can pull ordinary people into extraordinary moments, and what that says about the country that we're becoming. Welcome back, my friends, to the Derate the Hate podcast. I'm your host, Wilk Wilkinson, your blue-collar sage, calming outrage and helping to navigate a world divided by fog and those who would spread that fear, outrage, and grievance. The Derate the Hate podcast is proudly produced in collaboration with Braver Angels, America's largest grassroots, cross-partisan organization working towards civic renewal. This podcast amplifies the mission that we share to foster a more respectful and united America where civic friendship thrives even when we disagree. Each week, through the power of story, conversation, and connection with incredible guests, we work to build bridges instead of barriers. Not to change minds on the issues, but to change how we see one another when we differ. Because, friends, it really is about bettering the world one attitude at a time. We did not create the hate, but together we can derate the hate. So be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, share it with a friend, and visit braverangels.org to learn how you can get involved in the movement to bridge the partisan divide. Friends, I am so incredibly grateful that you have joined me for another powerful Derate the Hate episode. So let's get to it. Today's conversation is one that stayed with me long after the microphones were turned off. I'm joined by Michael Premo, an award-winning journalist and filmmaker with Storyline Media, whose latest film, Homegrown, premiered at the Venice Film Festival and recently won a DuPont Columbia Award, one of the most prestigious honors in broadcast journalism. In Homegrown, Michael and his team spent years embedded with three men involved in the Proud Boys: a father-to-be in New Jersey, a Latino Navy veteran from Texas, and an Air Force veteran organizing in New York City, tracking their journeys before, during, and after the events of January 6th. What struck me most is that this film refuses to flatten people into caricatures. It doesn't traffic in cheap outrage and easy villains. Instead, it forces us to confront something more uncomfortable. How often extremism isn't driven by ideology first, but by the human hunger for belonging, purpose, and some type of community. We talk about grievance grifters, outrage entrepreneurs, and the chaos of January 6th as it unfolded in real time, and why toxic polarization, not left or right, is the real disease eating away at our beloved country. This is not an easy topic, but it's an important one. Let's get into it with my friend, Michael Premo. Here we go. Michael Premo, thank you for joining me on the Derate the Hate podcast. It's great to see you again today, my friend.
Yeah, thanks, Wilk. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so we met not too terribly long ago when you had reached out to introduce me to a film that you and Storyline Media have made, and I've got to tell you, and I'm going to share it with the audience here, but I've got to tell you that this movie, after watching it, it just hit me in a way that I didn't really expect it would, and it's one of those things that, as an American and somebody who very much considers myself a patriot, somebody who absolutely loves my country, when I watched this movie, Michael, it was like one of those things that, and this is just for me, but it was one of those things that that you see it and then you can't unsee it, and it just continues to kind of rattle around in your brain for a while. But then there was another part of me that said, oh my God, I got to go take a shower. I mean, I got to be honest. And that's not a bad thing about the film, but the content of the film just made me feel different. And so why don't you tell me? Okay, well, first let me do this. Because the movie is called Homegrown, and just for context for the DTH listeners, the movie is about you kind of entrenching yourself or following around three members of the Proud Boys from several months, maybe even a couple years before the event on January 6th to shortly after January 6th, the riots and the events of January 6th, 2021. And then, so with that being the context, Michael, why don't you go ahead and tell me what was the genesis of this idea for you and your wife to make this movie with Storyline Media?
So the original idea was kind of kicking around in our head around 2016, 2017, 2018, as we just, saw the vitriol of the national discourse, just like the temperatures just kept rising and rising. And we wanted to know what people were fighting for and why they were fighting for what they claimed to be fighting for. We just wanted to better understand. And we were particularly interested in people who increasingly said that, violence might be the only way to solve our problems right now. And so we set out to understand what was driving people, what was motivating people to sort of get out from in front of their keyboards and get into the streets and go to these rallies and events. And what we found was an increasing number of people, many of whom were kind of losing faith in democracy. They no longer saw it as something that was serving their interests or something that wasn't fully captured by these corporate elites. And we wanted to better understand sort of how they're making sense of their world. And that led us on this journey where we followed about a dozen people across the country who were all sort of called to action in this moment, so to speak. And it wasn't actually until we got into the edit that we had to make kind of hard choices around who was in the final film. But the final people that ended up in the film, we felt were broadly representative of different types of people that we had met over the 4 or 5 years of making the film.
And that's one of the questions that I was going to ask you, Michael, because when I look at the three, people that you chose to follow in the film, and that was one of the things that I was going to ask is, do you think that they were kind of broadly representative of that mindset? I mean, you've got three guys in there, and the way that you describe it in the synopsis of the film, I thought was pretty good. It says, Homegrown follows a father-to-be in New Jersey, an Air Force veteran in New York City, and a charismatic activist from Texas, crisscrossing the country during this period of profound national fracture. And the Proud Boys is something that I don't know how many people know a lot about the Proud Boys. I know very little, have spent very little time actually researching anything about them. I've seen what I've seen in video clips and stuff like that. But I have done my share of research on kind of extremist organizations and things like that over the course of my time doing depolarization work, doing the Derate the Hate podcast. I've had some of the most profound people in the extremist kind of realm that are no longer extremists, thankfully, on my podcast. But I see what the Proud Boys were doing in your film now. It gave me a much deeper insight into their activities, especially leading up to the riots on January 6th. So these guys, Chris, Thad, and Randy, that you follow in the film, they were. I mean, can people watch this film and find that to be a pretty strong representation, pretty accurate representation of kind of what the Proud Boys were? I don't know. I mean, are the Proud Boys even really a thing anymore? Have they pretty much disbanded since January 6th? What can you tell me?
Yeah, no, I mean, they're very much still a thing. There's active chapters still across the country. I'd be curious to actually hear kind of what you think and sort of, the people that you've been talking to, how these individuals land for you and are representative or not representative of what you've experienced. But I'll start by saying that we selected these three folks became our final participants in the film because they were broadly representative of all types of people that we had met over the course of our reporting and investigation. Chris, who is one individual in the film, he's from New Jersey. He's an electrician, does for work. He's married to this woman who's a nurse. He is somebody who self-identifies as never really paying attention or being interested in politics until Trump. And there was something about, when he first rode down that golden elevator and kind of burst onto the national scene in a political way, that he was really sort of like motivated to pay attention. And it really spoke to something in him. I also, I think was fascinating for somebody who's from the tri-state area, New York State, who, we grew up with Trump our whole lives, not just on the Apprentice, but he was in the tabloids, since I was small, and Chris is about the same age. So that was interesting that he never really paid attention to politics in general until Trump. And we met so many people across the country in the conservative movement who never really, or self-identified as never really being engaged with politics until Trump burst onto the scene and sort of spoke to them in a particular way. So that's him. Thad is a Latino gentleman from South Texas who we met in the Pacific Northwest. And at the time he was living in Utah. And he represents this increasing multiculturalism, the sort of Black and brown Latino men and women who I met at conservative rallies and conservative events across the country. And I think it's really important to talk about the increasing kind of multicultural participation in the conservative movement, because it's not something that the mainstream media talks about. And I think it's an important layer to really kind of understand the dynamics of conservatism through that lens. And, before the 2024 election, it wasn't something that was really part of the conversation. And so, but every sort of rally and event that we went to, we met Black and brown folks. And that was just something that we didn't see when we turned on CNN. So we thought it was really important and critical to the film to include that perspective. And then Randy is originally from Maine, but lives in New York City, an Air Force veteran who represents that sort of backbone of any social movements. He's the quiet, behind the scene organizer. He may get up on stage at a rally or two and say a few words if there's no one else. But, his job is really behind the scenes, rallying the troops, spreading information, trying to get people together, doing the hard work of organizing and bringing people together. That type of work is often hard to film because it's the sort of unsexy kind of keyboard, behind the scenes work. But, it's really critical to how movements function and move and grow. And so it's really important to include Randy in the film for that reason.
Sure. No, I can see it. And one of the things that I really like about there's a number of different things that I really like about the film and its structuring and everything else is the kind of, it's not like three guys that are just the same, just like these three automaton figures that are, or whatever, they're very different personalities. For me, I gotta be honest, I really resonated with Thad, I think the most. I know a ton of people like him. I thought he was a very thoughtful person in how he's clearly a strong family man, a Navy veteran. I'm a Navy veteran. He was in probably a little after I got out, but I really resonated with him. And I think one of the things that I really resonated with, and maybe people in Utah will remember this, but he actually went on the news and did like a joint press conference in Utah at a Proud Boys rally with one of the local leaders of Black Lives Matter, and developed a friendship with, I forget the gal's name, but But talk about that a little bit and talk about Thad and that uniqueness that he had, because like I said, he really resonated with me, or I resonated with him and who he was, and thought him to be kind of a genuine and loving person that you might not expect to see in a movement like that.
Yeah, that's right. I feel like, I grew up with guys like that. And, Thad is like one of those people who's just trying to figure things out and is like really trying to like put his head into like making sense of things, and off sometimes is not making always the best choices because he can be a little impulsive. And I was like, yeah, I know this person. And I think a lot of people know somebody like this. And, that sort of like thoughtfulness and sort of like wrestling with how to solve problems and understand the bigger picture led him to this really unlikely friendship with Jakari, who was a Black Lives Matter activist in Salt Lake. And that came out of both his work and the sort of Proud Boy chapter in Salt Lake City, which I thought was really interesting because they caught a lot of flack from other Proud Boys and other conservatives for even bothering to talk to an activist from the other side, quote unquote. And so I think that was really fascinating. And I was really kind of drawn to their kind of like interest in having this conversation, because I think it like really nuanced who these people are in a way that I think complicates this idea of this sort of us and them narrative that we fall into, where we just kind of put people in these boxes and there's like no nuance or gray area after that.
No, I think that's just an amazing point. It's something that I've talked about so much is, first of all, no group is a monolith. They're just not. And you're going to find all kinds of nuance in anything and in any movement. That one stood out a lot for me just because of the work that I've done for so long with Braver Angels and bridging divides and just the idea of completely discounting other people. You mentioned the us versus them dynamic and these rigid binaries that people always want to play in nowadays, and it's just not the case. And I just want to make sure that I highlight how you highlighted that in the film, and I think it's important. So thank you for doing that. So as you were making this film, I mean, obviously, just like anything, it's there's what's inside the lens and what's outside the lens, and oftentimes all the stuff that's outside the lens completely gets missed. So, Michael, what was the biggest takeaway for you more broadly? I mean, obviously we'll talk more about the film itself and what happens inside the lens, but outside the lens, what was your biggest takeaway from this experience? It's a multi-year experience for you, and there's a lot going on, or was a lot going on there. So what was the biggest takeaway for you outside the lens?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest takeaways from this process in general was really understanding that it's not necessarily, I think there is this perception that what draws people to maybe particular groups or particular social movements is this ideological sort of drive. And I think it's very rare that people are driven by ideology to begin with. And what I encountered was people that were looking for community. They were looking for purpose. They were looking for meaning. They were looking to like kind of make sense of a world that doesn't make sense often, and not necessarily driven by ideology. Maybe sometimes people sort of end up in sort of some sort of ideological rigidity, but even the people I feel like that were the most dogmatic about whatever the sort of politics might have been, it was more to like be accepted in a group and to be seen and to have their feelings and values honored and recognized more so than any sort of ideological purity. And I think that is a really important point to understand what draws people to participate in movements across the political spectrum. And I think that is something that was the big takeaway overall. We met so many people that are, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum, we're in a place in history where the political system, the economy is so captured by this sort of corporate elites. It's so sort of bent in their favor. and people are just trying to like feed their families and go about their business and finding different answers for why things are the way they are. But the core motivations are very, very similar.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of good points there, and I do find it fascinating, the idea that people aren't necessarily driven by their ideology, but many of the other things, and the things that you brought up. I mean, looking for community and belonging and purpose. I mean, these are very important things. Having had many conversations with former radicals and extremists myself, I know that this is a thing. And just to clarify, I'm not saying that everybody in the Proud Boys or everybody that does this is a radical or an extremist, but the need for community, the need for belonging, the need for purpose when you have no purpose sometimes drives people to be something that they wouldn't otherwise be, or join something that they wouldn't otherwise join. And where I get bothered by this, and I'm just going to share one of the things that bothers me most about that, when it comes to, especially when it comes to like political ideology and stuff like that, is when that is the case, often those loud and ugly voices start to overtake those people within an ideology that do work on principle and do work on moral clarity. Yeah. And I think that explains a lot about what's happening in our country today. Mm-hmm. I mean, the loudest and ugliest voices have captured certain ideological movements and overtaken it, and then the principled and people, you know, the morally clear and I'm going to say it, people of good character are kind of pushed out.
That's absolutely right.
And no longer run the movement. And then
That's right.
And then that political ideology becomes tainted and gives everybody else a false perception of it. Again, you know, kind of inside the lens versus outside the lens thinking. Yeah. Because now everything that's happening, everything that's going down on film, every little video that you see when you're doom scrolling on your phone or whatever on social media captures the loudest and the ugliest voices.
Correct.
And everything outside the lens gets drowned out.
Correct.
Talk to me about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely correct. I think the other thing that was slightly, so what is outside the quote unquote the lens is what we wanted to turn our lens on, if that makes sense. Yeah. So what we were observing as I was doing research for this film, and by doing research, I was reading a ton of stuff from across the political spectrum, and I was out there talking to people and meeting people at all different types of environments all across the country. And, you know, one thing that I observed among the loudest, the leaders, if I said their name, you'd probably instantly, or some of these listeners would instantly recognize them. And what I noticed that there was two categories of the people who were the loudest. One category were the true believers, who are people that I feel like they believe what they are saying. They believe they have some sort of ideological vision for society or some aspect of society and are driven by that. And there are some of those people among those voices, but the vast majority of the individuals that I met were just grifters, hustlers, people who were just like exploiting outrage just to like get likes and clicks, and had turned that into something very lucrative for themselves. And I feel like when we were in quiet moments, sort of like just at the bar, kind of in a corner of a room in a restaurant, just like talking, like their outlook was very different. Like there was a switch that turned. And I think that like why we wanted to focus on people who weren't the sort of most known individuals, but the quote unquote foot soldiers, the average everyday activists, is because we wanted to see this sort of like rank and file, what these people who are sort of outside the traditional lens are like in doing the quote unquote ordinary everyday folks. Because of that. And it was fascinating to spend time with some of these folks who I was like, you do not believe the thing you are selling people.
That is absolutely fascinating. But I mean, it shouldn't be fascinating. I mean, it confirms one of the things that I talk about the most, Michael, is these outrage entrepreneurs and grievance grifters is what I call them. I think you probably heard me say that on the podcast before. But yeah, outrage entrepreneurs and grievance grifters, they don't always believe what they are saying, but they know they are going to get that reaction.
Yeah.
They know they are going to get the clicks. They know they are going to get the notoriety from capitalizing on people's fear, outrage, and grievance. And they do it over and over and over again because it's a proven model. Yeah. And it's so ugly and it's so disingenuous, but it works.
Yeah.
And it's painful to me to watch what that has done to our country. You know, I've been saying quite often lately, Michael, that you know, the biggest problem in our country is not the right. The biggest problem in our country is not the left. The biggest problem in our country is toxic polarization and us versus them tribalism. Everything else is just a symptom.
Yeah.
Everything else is just a symptom. The disease is toxic polarization and political us versus them tribalism. And Michael, we, the people, are the host, and America is going to be the casualty if we don't get that under control, because everything else is just a symptom of that broader disease.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. You know, and I think one of the kind of beautiful intentions of the American political system was trying to eliminate that us versus them that's inherent in the parliamentary system, where you have a governing party and an opposition party, and the sort of like structural innovation that the architects of this country were trying to make was like, how do you deal with tribalism by bringing people together and forcing them to be able to govern in a way where, you know, they can make compromises in the good of the people. So it's absolutely tragic to see where we are today, where people are just, they no longer see the other party, the other person, the other political ideology as a equal partner in governance. And that's a terrifying turning point in this country.
It is a terrifying turning point. I can't, you know, being I will just say that right now, being in the state of Minnesota where I live is a weird thing. And it should be something that concerns every single American. I mean, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, what is happening here in the state of Minnesota as of right now, in the past 2 weeks, or well, now almost 3 weeks as of the date of this recording, we've had 3 people in Minnesota shot by federal law enforcement, ICE and Customs and Border Patrol. 2 died, and 1 was shot in the leg. But more than that, I mean, we've got people, again, starting stuff on fire. We've got many people that are peacefully protesting, but then there are clearly these kind of Antifa-style figures out there in their helmets and running around with sleds for shields and stuff like that. And it's in my mind, Michael, the divide in this country is getting to a point where it's not red versus blue. It's those who want chaos and calamity and pandemonium. And then there's those who want, you know, civility. They want calm. They want, you know, these predictable norms. But it's not healthy. And again, it's just a symptom. I mean, Donald Trump and his administration are not the root cause of this. They are a symptom of that bigger problem. Again, Michael, we're getting close to the end of our time here, and I want to have you tell me a little bit about, you know, we're not going to give away the whole film, but I want people to know where they can find it. So, but as we wrap up, just take a couple minutes real quick. Tell me about January 6th, because I know you were there. You and your cameras were there, right in the mix of what was happening. And tell me what that felt like for you. Tell me what you saw and how that felt for you.
Yeah, so we ended up there that day by following one of our main participants in the film, Chris, who was there. And, we try to show this in the film. The January 6th was planned in public. Like, there may have been private meetings that people had about what they were going to do that day, but there was no sort of, in my opinion and what I observed, there wasn't this sort of secret conspiracy necessarily. Everything was planned in public. The plan was to storm the Capitol, was to, prevent the certification of the election. And so because it was so planned so publicly, I assumed, after having seen many protests in Washington, D.C., that the D.C. police and the Parks police would have, the Capitol completely cordoned off and completely surrounded. And I was absolutely surprised by the sort of to follow Chris to the base of the Capitol and not see everything law enforcement prepared to the level that I assumed that they would be prepared. And so when I saw this, I was, turned to my producing partner and who's doing sound. I'm doing camera, and Rachel does sound and is our producer. And I was like, put on your helmet and gas mask because this is about to get crazy. And that just people who've been in situations like that, it's just sort of like adrenaline kicks in, and like all I'm focused on is like doing my job, like making sure that the record button is pressed and that I'm following Chris wherever he goes, whatever he's doing, and I saw people that were there, excited to be able to prevent the peaceful transition of power. I saw people that were excited to storm the Capitol and, as Chris kept saying, string up Pelosi, string up Schumer, and halt this sort of democratic process for what they believe was a stolen election. And it was wild. It was absolutely wild. It was, all the sort of like conversation around what people wanted to do and how publicly they were talking about, I thought maybe should have prepared me to not be as absolutely shocked as I was. But I like to say that I was sort of like, we were not surprised, but completely shocked, and I also wasn't prepared for people to fight police so virulently, for these folks who were, for the last however months were just so staunchly Blue Lives Matter, but how quickly Blue Lives Matter crowd became Blue Lives Splatter crowd. And they just went to war with these cops, fighting them in hand-to-hand combat for 4 or 5 hours where I was, the west side of the Capitol. And it was wild. It was really wild.
Like I said, this is one of those films. When I watched it, I was just shocked. I was shocked and surprised. I looked at this and I guess one of the things that shocks me now a lot, because of the events over the past couple of weeks, is a lot of those same people that have been for 5 plus years now, 5 plus years. Yeah, 5 plus years have been screaming, this was not a insurrection, this was not an insurrection, this was not an insurrection, are now calling for the Insurrection Act in the state of Minnesota. Again, people lose it's not about principles, it's not about ideology, it's about that sense of belonging, that sense of community, and whatever, their buddy on either side of them is saying, I think they kind of go along with, and it's not about principles or ideology. That's just me taking a piece of personal prerogative because it's my show, but it's shocking, and I would say that everybody they've got to go out and see this movie. They've got to get a hold of this movie, Homegrown, see what I'm talking about, see what Michael's talking about. Michael Premo, tell the DTH listeners where people can find this film, and they've just got to see it. Everybody's got to see it.
Yeah, so the Homegrown is available you can rent it until February 16th at homegrown.film. After that, we hope to sort of go wider to different platforms. So we're still sort of waiting to figure out that next step. But currently it's available to rent at Homegrown Film till President's Day, which is February 16th. So we invite people to come and check it out. We also have a place on our website that if people are interested in doing screenings, we're really interested for individuals or groups or, do a house party with some neighbors to do screenings. We're really interested in that, or we're really hoping that the film can be a source of conversation and debate among people as we, really think about what the future of American democracy can look like.
Michael Premo, thank you so much for joining me here on Derate the Hate. I do appreciate it, man.
Wilk, you're a stand-up guy. It's an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with you. I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate the work you do with Derate the Hate and Braver Angels. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Friends, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. And if there's anything in this episode that provided exceptional value to you, please make sure to hit that share button. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to subscribe to get the Derate the Hate podcast sent to your email inbox every week. We really are better together, so please take a moment to visit braverangels.org and consider joining the movement towards civic renewal and bridging our political divides. This is Wilk wrapping up for the week saying get out there, be kind to one another, be grateful for everything you've got, and remember, it's up to you to make every day the day that you want it to be. With that, my friends, I'm going to back on out of here, and we will catch you next week. Take care.